Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and welcome to this video on some lessons learned from building a card game simulator prototype with Vue, Phaser, Socket.io, and Express. I'm a tabletop game developer, and if you've seen any of my videos, I like digitizing tabletop games, like card games and so on, and I thought it'd be fun to try my hand at making a prototype of a card game simulator with a little bit of design elements if you're a tabletop game designer to help you along and just see what that was like. I chose to use Vue and Phaser in terms of the front end for the implementation because I'm most familiar with those frameworks when working in JavaScript, and a little bit of Socket.io to connect the pieces together, and also Express for a small server component. I'm going to walk you through what the prototype does, and then we're going to walk through the code as well to see how the thing was built, and you can poke at it yourself and check out all the code on GitHub and clone it if you like, work on your own card game simulator, and just see if it helps your own process in making your own JavaScript-based card games. So we're looking at the site, which is hosted on Heroku. And so what we see here from the get-go is there's two main tabs. There's a designer tab and a simulator tab. I'm currently on the designer tab, and if I click over to the simulator, I get to see this little phaser component that says create a deck in the designer to begin the simulation. So we're not able to do that just yet. If you're not familiar with either Vue or Phaser, they're worth looking into. Vue is a front-end JavaScript framework that does basically everything you'd need a front-end framework to do, particularly if you're making a single-page application. And Phaser is a free and open-source game engine or game development framework that is fairly easy to use, and I have a bunch of videos on it if you're interested in diving in further. So what I do, so as we'll see in the code structure and hierarchy, the Vue does most of the heavy lifting in terms of the designer. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say create game, and this little modal pops up, and I'm going to say, let's call my game Entromancy. That's the name of one of my games, and I'll give it a description. Say it's a new tabletop role-playing game. 1R will suffice. I'll say add game, and then that shows up, and I can create another game, and let's call this Hacker Battles. That's another one of my games, and let's call that a new card game. Okay, so now these show up, and everything should work with the Flexbox, so that if you change the size of the window, or if you're looking on mobile, something I had to work on quite a bit to make these responsive for mobile, everything should just readjust accordingly and be responsive. So when I select a game, let's say I'm selecting Entromancy, it takes me to this second level of content, and I'll create a container. And that could be one of three different types of containers. It could be a deck if I'm working on a card game. It could be some sort of list or a mechanics group. We'll look at each one of these in turn. Let's start with the easier ones. We'll just say this list is my new NPCs, non-player character that I'm using in this role-playing game, let's say. And I'll say it's a list of all local NPCs, and I'll select list. And then I'll say add container. And so I have this new NPCs list, and I'll go drill down one more level, and I'll select this list, and I'll say create a list item, and let's call them, what I call these, Marty and Martha Barkeep, and let's say they're the Town Tavern Keeps, and I can add this list item, and so I can add a bunch of these things. Actually, let's create another one. Let's call them Martha and Marty Innkeeps, and these are my Town Innkeeps. And I could put a lot more stuff in here if I wanted to. And then let's say that I'm playing, I'm the dungeon master or the game master for a role-playing game, and I want to select between these different NPCs at random. Well, I could select a random list item by pressing this button, and then this modal pops up, and it says that it's selected Marty and Martha Barkeep, and those are Town Tavern Keeps. so I could just keep going, running my adventure. I could select another one, and let's see if we can get the in keeps to come up. There we go. So we know that it's working more or less random. I'm going to go back one level up to the containers and create another container. And let's say this this is my core mechanics group. And I'll say these are my new mechanics for combat, let's say. Let's say I'm developing a role-playing game, or I just need some place to house the mechanics for one of my card or board games. I can add this container, select it, and then create a new mechanic. And let's say this is my core combat role. And let's say this is the core mechanic for all combat roles. And then there's I'll choose a dice model. I'll say that this is going to run on a D20 system, like Dungeons and Dragons or something, or one of my games, Entromancy. And I'll say every time you roll it, you have to roll 1 D20 plus 5. And I'll add that mechanic. And then you can helpfully just roll this mechanic right here to see, what some of the outcomes might be. And let's say you have a bunch of different mechanics and you want to weigh them against one another. This might be a way of kind of determining, collating or curating all of your different mechanics so that you can look at them all together and refer back to them as needed. So that's like if I'm making a role-playing game or a let's say a board game. I want to collect those things. But let's say that I'm creating a card game. I'll click on select game, create a container, and you can access this site on your own and just play around with this as you like and try and break it and whatever. And of course, like I said, you can clone the code and dive in here and make your own adjustments to see if this is useful for your own either your own games or your development process, and just kind of pick at it. And let's call this the core deck for my new game. And let's just say this is all cards for new Hacker Battles prototype. And I'm going to call this a deck. Add the container. Calling it a deck is going to let the simulator know that I want to create cards. And so my first card, let's say it's called Shadowbolt, and it deals 1d6 damage, whatever. And then I'll create another one, and we'll call that, I don't know, Lightbolt. And it says, what it does, it heals 1d6 damage. Just making this up. So I have my different cards. And now what I need to do on this screen is to export it into the simulator. And once I do that, we'll see when I go to the simulator, it says that it's simulating the name of the deck, which is core deck. And we see that Shadowbolt has been populated into each of these different deck wells or whatever. And I have a few different options here that is being run by Phaser. And I should say that the reason why I'm running Phaser within a larger view app is that I find the drag and drop mechanics to be a lot simpler and easier to use, at least for me, within Phaser. You could use a drag and drop framework within Vue or make your own, I suppose. It's just that this is my experience, and of course having Phaser be a game framework allows me to leverage certain game-specific options when I'm doing the simulation, rather than Vue, which is really more like just an interactive UI framework. But when I hover over one of these cards, I see that it also shows me a larger version of the card in case I have text that's hard to see. And I can drag and drop these around the screen. And I see that Lightbolt is right underneath that. And then I can simulate what it's like to put these on a board, which I find to be really useful. Like when I'm designing card games, for example, when I was designing my first card game, I was doing it with pen and paper, and I found that I had to scribble them onto note cards or whatever, and then shuffle them, and then I would realize that I needed to make a quick change, and I would have to rip up that card and write a new one, or it's kind of messy. So I wanted some sort of way or methodology for being able to digitally represent these cards and move them around on screen, while also being able to change them on the fly and then re-import them, which you can do easily in the designer just by going back in here and then creating a new deck and exporting it into the simulator. And some other like just quality of life things that you have here. You could say that I want to clean up the cards, send them back to their deck wells. I could shuffle them within their deck wells. I can deal player A cards. I can deal player B cards so that they're just like neatly on the screen. And these, as you can see, like there's a lot of room here if you have like, you know, a dozen cards or whatever. And then you could, for example, go into this code and just muck around with the UI so that you have either different functionality here on the right, or you have, let's say you need 4 different player areas, or, you know, you're making a board game and you want to make tokens instead of cards. You could absolutely do that and then have different representations on the board so that you can move this stuff around without having to do it with pen and paper. And most of the trappings are here for you to go ahead and you know, hack into it and do it. And that's basically it. So like if I you know, wanted to create a new container, and I would say like this is the expansion deck, and I'm just going to repeat that and say this is the expansion deck, and create this new container. Select this container and say this is going to be a new kind of bolt. Let's say lightning bolt, and it deals 1d6 area of effect damage, and then a firebolt is a really boring game, but what can you do? This deals 1d10 damage. I can export this into the simulator now, and now I'm dealing with the lightning bolt and firebolt. Like it's just cleaned this up for me, and it's simulating the expansion deck now. Pretty cool. So obviously this is just like, it's just a sketch of a prototype. Like I really shouldn't even be calling it a prototype because it doesn't do all that much. It's just giving you an idea of what it could do. And I'm not even really sure how useful the other containers are. The where are we? If I created a list or a mechanics group, I mean, I think essentially this works best as the card game simulator. Has a little designer area for you to create your cards, and then a simulator area for you to move them around. There's some things, I mean, there's a lot of things it doesn't do, right, in terms of functionality. But the main thing that it doesn't do, it doesn't save your state. So like every time you open this website, you're going to have to create everything over and over again. And what would be really cool is to add a database to this so that you could save your games. You could save them or either locally or, you know, to the cloud somewhere. And that's just not something that I really wanted to put the time into for this. But that would be an ideal scenario, right? To be able to say like, okay, I'm saving, not only am I saving this game, I'm saving all my NPCs or all my game, my game mechanics, all of my cards or decks. And I'm also saving this simulation. So like I'm in the middle of simulating this game, and I need to run out and get a pizza. Well, when I come back and after pizza's eaten and dishes are washed, I'm still have the cards on the board and can go back to this. That would be really cool. Okay, so that's basically how the simulator and the designer works. Let's talk about let's dive into the code, and then we'll talk more about some lessons learned. So as you'll see, if you dive into the repository for this, the main app is a Vue app that just is rendered as a static, a static app in this distribution or distributable folder. You can look at that on your own time. I built this using the Vue CLI, which I find to be helpful for most things Vue related. The main entry point is, of course, this main.js that is referred to in the index.html. I think this has to be built for you to really be able to see what's going on, but it's this main div ID app that is where everything loads up. And main.js, this has a few things that we'll talk about in a little bit. This uses Vuex as a store to store all of the information and save whatever state is going on in the app while you're using it. We'll talk about that in a bit. Just want to show you the app.vue component. The main component of this Vue app is app.vue, and it has the menu container and the games container and the simulator container. It's just everything you see on the screen when you first run into this simulator, this whole thing. And then it imports a number of different components, which is in this components folder, which we'll look at one at a time. And then it has a number of different methods, which is how one of the ways in which Vue handles interactivity. Like when the modal pops up and you want to cancel it, or if you want to create a game, the modal for doing so should pop up, and different toggles and so on and so forth. Then it has the styling in the in CSS here at the bottom. If you work with Vue, this will be no challenge for you to look through. If you haven't, but you have some HTML or JavaScript web design background, you should be pretty at home pretty quickly after doing a quick Vue tutorial. Let's look at the components. That's where most of the information is here. So as you can see, there's a lot of components. The modals are really simple to understand. They're just like, if I need to create a card or a container or a game, as we saw, each one of these modals will pop up, and there's certain stylings for them to make sure that they're mobile ready, and also methods to make sure that the information that you enter gets back into the Vuex store that we'll look at in a moment. And then there's a component for each of the different components that we see here on the screen. Like for each card, there's a component. For each container, there's a component. For the bucket that contains all the containers, like when I click into here, when I go into this game, and now I'm in this containers bucket, well, that's what it looks like here in this component. And each of them are styled, and they have their own methods to make sure that the interactivity works. And then I have a simulator component, which is basically this blank screen that houses the actual simulator, which is being run by Phaser. And this gets into one of the learnings that I had with building an app with multiple frameworks, which I haven't done before. Usually, in my own, hobbyist coder experience, I've taken a framework like Vue and just like built an app with that, or taken Phaser and built an app with that. And maybe I'll use Socket.io or Express on the back end to like provide some connective tissue, but never really tried to house a Phaser app within a Vue app or something like that. And that required some workarounds that I'll show in a moment. This Vue app, this Vue simulator component, it basically just has an asynchronous mounted function or method that awaits the import of the simulator .js file, which is the entry point for the Phaser piece of the puzzle. And once that is imported, then it launches the game, and it passes some information about the container and also the room ID, which is part of the Socket.io part of the puzzle. Well, let's take this all one piece at a time, because it can be a little bit tricky to wrap your head around if you haven't done anything like this before. And I must say that I'm deeply indebted to a template for running Phaser within Vue. I'll link that in the description to this video, along with the GitHub and the link for the running simulator. Okay, so before getting into this, let's just look at store. In main.js, we are using Vuex, which is a store, which is basically, as I mentioned, a way to store information about the state of your app while someone is using it. And it's so that you don't have to jump through so many hoops with passing information or props, if you've heard of that, between the different components. And so the store, the Vuex store, contains stuff like the state of the app, like is a container showing what is the state of modals? Is a modal up, which will govern some things about the UI. I have things like selected game ID. So like each game that is created, each game component that is created is given an ID so that we can easily access them and render them on screen. And then when things are mutated, like when we create a game, I want to add to the state a new game and give it an ID and a name that's passed to it from the component, the modal where we created the game, a description, and so on and so forth, and then make it so that when the app requests something from the state, I'm easily able to retrieve that game or container or card or whatever by using its ID that we've used for it. There's also another thing here which is called store room ID, and that's state.room ID is equal to socket ID. Let's talk about that right now. So one of the ways in which to communicate between apps or different parts of the app is to use socket.io. Socket.io is a JavaScript library for working with WebSockets for different types of communication. And I use socket.io here for two different things. One, I use it for communicating between the phaser and the view parts of the app. And I also use it to communicate between phaser and the little server component that we have, which we'll take a look at. Let's go back to this simulator. Here in the simulator component, when we launch the game, we're going to pass to it the container ID so that the phaser component knows where to launch, and then we also pass the room ID for socket.io. So the way that socket.io works is that it has when you launch into a WebSocket session, it provides a room ID so that you can communicate within a specific room across, like, let's say, different clients. Like, so if we're playing a multiplayer game, we're using socket.io, I want to use a specific room that I log into or that socket.io provides for me so that I can talk to you, or my client can talk to yours, and we're not just talking to the entire internet. And so I pass that to the game simulator, which in simulator.js, this is just a basic phaser entry point with the methodology that, like I mentioned, that I use is from a template that I'll share in the comments or in the description of the video. It's pretty basic phaser stuff. I want to launch it using the room ID that we discussed before, and it's going to run at 1800 by 1000 pixels, blah blah blah, whatever. And it's going to use we have one scene, and that's how phaser uses, like, if you have different, like, let's say, levels in a I don't know, a runner, or an endless runner, or in a platformer, you'd use different scenes. And so my main scene here is just a really basic scene. It's it creates player cards, just an empty array, and opponent cards, empty array, and it uses a UI handler that I've created, as well as an interactivity handler and a socket handler. And all of this works together. So, like, my interactivity handler, it says that, like, when somebody clicks the pointer down, it's going to emit to socket.io that it wants socket.io to deal player cards, or it does simple things that, like, when a pointer goes over the opponent cards, what is this? It's not quite a button, but the text. We want it to change color. It says that when I click shuffle cards, that I should, let socket.io that I want to do that. And the socket handler works with everything in terms of dealing with socket.io. You can look through this on your own time. And also the UI handler just builds the UI for us. We also have a little card component here, or a card.js class, which creates the basic UI and sets the scene for the basic interactivity of each of the cards that are displayed on the screen. So where does this all go? So the socket sends a message. What happens with it? Well, I have a little server.js that uses Express, and it also uses a few different things like cross-origin resource sharing and this little framework called Shuffle. One of the important things to remember here, well, there's a few different things to remember here. One is that the dependency tree, one of the learnings that I found in this is that the dependency tree is really real for something like this. If you're not using like an all-in-one engine like Unity, for example, although with Unity you're going to have a lot of dependencies anyway, so I don't know what I'm saying. You're going to have to piece together a lot of different things to make sure that you have the functionality that you want, unless you're going like total bare metal and you're building everything yourself. So you see, I have a bunch of dependencies that are here that I'm using for this app, and they can get kind of out of hand sometimes. And one of the issues that you might come across is cross-origin resource sharing. You might just want to look it up. It's a good thing to know about, but basically if you're working with an app that has requests coming from a different location than where the app is being hosted, I think I'm describing that right, but please check the documentation for course to make sure you have the exact definition of it. You can get thrown issues because for security concerns. So you have to do a little bit of work on the back end to make sure that everything's set up for cross-origin resource sharing. And then what Socket.io does is that when it detects that a new session has begun and a new client has connected to it, it stores that information and it sends everybody, in this case just the view part of the app and the phaser part of the app, to the same room so they can communicate between one another. And so it's not like everybody's using this app at the same time and they're all getting cards from each other. No, it's just the session that's happening by one user. And then when it gets an export deck directive from the View app, when you say export deck by pushing that button, then it sends that information to the phaser app with each of the informations about the card, so that then the phaser app can import those cards and make them functional. Or when you say deal decks within the phaser app, it emits that to the server, and then the server then in turn emits it back to the phaser app so that the phaser can deal decks or shuffle them or deal opponent cards or whatever you want to do. And you might ask, well, why don't you just do this based on like within phaser itself? And the reason why I built it this way is that if you can imagine that at some point I might want to have a multiplayer version of this and open up two different tabs, or if I want you to play the game with me on your client, somewhere across the continent or the world, well, then that communication is going to have to happen via a central location like a server at some point. So I've built in the framework or the structure, the architecture for that to be a possibility. So let's just take one more look at where do we export decks here. I think that's in our, is it the deck? Yeah, export deck. So this is one of the main key points. So when I go to, for example, just to give you an idea about how Socket.io factors into this, when I go into my, where do we put it? In Hacker Battles, and I go to my expansion deck and I click this export into simulator deck. Export into simulator button. That's where here I've imported Socket.io in the deck component, and I when I click the button, where's that button here? Export deck. See, that's how Vue handles interactivity. Is I have this v-on click export deck that triggers this method, which emits to Socket.io export deck, and it emits the selected container, which is this container here, the stack container, and to the room ID that we've stored when we joined socket.io. And that happens here in the created function. When this component is created, it connects to socket.io and it commits to the Vuex store, the room ID from it uses the socket ID of this particular socket instance or connection, and it says then it uses that the room ID. We'll just take a look at the server JS for export deck. All that information, like the cards and the names and descriptions, it goes to the to server JS on export deck. So the server receives that information and it stores it, and then it then emits import deck to the room, which is just the Vue and the Phaser clients working together. And we go to the Phaser client back into the, I think this is in the socket handler, import deck. So we've exported it and now we're importing it into Phaser. And on import deck, it changes the header text. It adds the text for deal player cards, deal opponent cards, shuffle decks, and cleanup cards. And then it emits for the client to clean up the cards and deal them using the scene room ID. And that's how everything then populates the cards that we see on the screen here. So that's the basic functionality of the simulator and the designer and how they all work together in the back end. There's a few other learnings that it's probably it may be interesting for you to hear. We talked about building an app with multiple frameworks. We've talked about how the dependency tree is real. We talked about using Vuex as a store. I should probably mention that if you didn't use Vuex as a store, then you're stuck with having to offer pass information back and forth and what's between components using what's called props, which is useful, and you can do that at any point in time. If you've used React or Vue, you'll be familiar with using props to say like, hey, here's the information that I want you to render specific to the app state. But doing so becomes tedious and onerous over time, and so the store provides a central location where all components can refer back to, so that you're able to have a more clean experience and streamlined experience in developing the app and making sure everything refers back to one source of truth, which is the store here in the main.js file. There's another thing that I wanted to mention too, and that's really it's about the design of the apps and of the entire app, and mostly the view part of it. Is that like my CSS is not very good. Let me go back to like maybe one of the let's go to the main app container or component. See, there's a bunch of CSS here, and my CSS is not very good. It's just like as you can see, this isn't like the prettiest app you've ever looked at. I used Bootstrap or Vue Bootstrap for most of these things. If you've used Bootstrap or seen it in anything, you're probably already familiar with how it makes your buttons pretty. It gives you like some built-in color variations and color palettes and stuff like that. So I cannot over-recommend the potential for you to do so much better at building your JavaScript-based apps, your front-end apps, by having better facility with CSS than I do. I'm okay with Flexbox. I'm okay with like some, just the basic functionality of things. But, this really does take a lot of time, especially if you have to like try something and then like you go back into it and it doesn't work properly, or like if you're thinking mobile first in terms of responsiveness, you really have to test this on your mobile app, like on a mobile app or in Chrome on mobile or wherever, so that along the way, so that you're not like done with the app and you're like, okay, I'm finished, and then you look at the your app on mobile and you're like, oh my God, none of this works. It's all out of order, or things aren't scaling correctly or whatever. So this takes a lot of time, and I highly recommend that you spend time doing this upfront so you don't get stuck with it later. And speaking of mobile first, like unless you have like a good IDE for doing so, sometimes it might be helpful to just have a way that you can stage your app or deploy it early on, rather than like I basically deployed this app to Heroku very late on in the development cycle for it, and then did all the mobile stuff, and like it was kind of like just not a great user experience for myself. So if you can figure out your deployment, when you have like a little bit of a working prototype, like much easier than this, you'll be happier when when you already have that pipeline in the works when you're developing later, particularly because there is some nitty gritty that you have to really get in the weeds in for your deployment configuration. For example, you might not run into cores at all, the cross-origin resource sharing, when you're just working on your computer or your local machine. But then when you deploy it, you're like, this isn't working, and I have no idea why, or I'm getting an error, or I'm not even getting anything. And one of the things that you have to do is you have to configure socket.io, or you have to determine, am I going to use the Vue CLI to build the app and save it in a folder like this distributable folder, and then use Express to serve it as just static files, or how am I gonna manage my deployment configuration? And so from the get-go, thinking through, okay, I'm gonna host this on Heroku. What are Heroku's requirements? What are the core requirements of each of my different dependencies to make sure that they all work together, not only on my local development environment, but also in a production environment? And one thing that I used here we didn't really talk about it, but I needed something to shuffle my cards for me, and I didn't want to build something myself, which you might be rolling your eyes at, because there are relatively easy ways of doing this, but I wanted something to handle it in a very specific way. So I used this shuffle dependency, and thankfully it just works. But there's some other things that you might import, just at the spur of the moment, or because you need something, and for some reason it doesn't work with your production app. So it's good to think about that early on and make sure that it all works together. So that's really it for this video. Like I said, I highly recommend digging into load up this designer and simulator, see if you can make it work for yourself, and think through how would you change it to make it more to have it better serve your needs within your development environment. Or if you were to send it to production, like what would it look like? Would you have some sort of database to back it up so people can save state? Would you scrap the phaser implementation altogether and just use Vue, or would you not use Vue at all and use something else, or not use JavaScript entirely? Think through it and then poke through the code and see if there's anything in here that you can benefit from. Like I said, one of the main learnings for me was how to tie together all the different pieces between Vue, Phaser, Express, and using socket.io as the connective tissue there. Definitely I had to work through how to, there was this conundrum, right? Because the Vue app loads, and then at some point the Phaser app loads, but then how does Phaser get the room ID information from socket.io if socket.io doesn't, there's just so many different components. And so that's when I had to dig into JavaScript knowledge and just see that because Vue and Phaser are operating using the same language, it's relatively easy. Where did I do this? I think in the simulator, to just, when we launch the game using this template that I mentioned, we launch it and we pass through the container ID of the Vue app, but then we can also at the same time just pass in the room ID that was established when Vue first connects to the Vue app connects to socket.io and stores it in the Vuex store. I can just pass that to my simulator.js, and then the Phaser app can use this both to load it up here in this simulator container, and also when it's passing messages through Socket.io to the server and back to itself in simulating this card game. And if we wanted to add multiplayer to it, we certainly could. Great. Well, I hope this is helpful for you in your own process of JavaScript game development. And if you're working on a tabletop game simulator, please let me know. And you can join our Discord and share your findings, or just feel free to share your apps and let us know what you're working on. And I hope this video is helpful for you. If it has, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. You can also follow me on Twitter. And I would just love for you to check out my tabletop games. You can do so at nightpathpub.com, or just follow the link in the description. And I hope to see you soon.